Sorry, I'm running a couple minutes late here, but let's go ahead and get right into class. So, does anyone have any questions on anything we've covered in the first couple days of this week? So, anything about database design, anything about SQL in general, any questions on your ERD, any questions on your homework assignment for this weekend, which is the capstone ERD, any questions in general before we dive into really getting started on full stack?
Yeah, I got a question.
Shoot.
When will you use offset for? Because I saw from the extra credit like you use like limit and then offset. So when will you need to use it?
Yeah, it's a great question. So sometimes when you like load a page, right? And it loads in like 100 different items, and then down at the bottom it has page 2 of 5. So think about Google, for example, right? When you Google how does the select statement work in SQL, right? If Google returned all of the results all at once, your computer would just burst into flames because Google has so many different results there. If it sent you all of the results all at once, your computer wouldn't be able to handle showing all of them. And the query would take so long for Google to run that it wouldn't be able to show you all of the results all at once anyway. And so the time that you use limit and offset is specifically for that. Limit is saying, hey, only give me the top 10 results of what's coming back. And then offset is saying now they've clicked on page 2, they would like the next 10 results, but offset by the first 10 because they were on the first page. So you use limit and offset when you have a very large data set that you want to only return the first 10 results of, and then you use offset to say now they want the next 20 results. And it depends, right? Depending on your application, you may say, hey, I want to show the first 250 results. And then if they scroll all the way to the bottom of the page, load the next 250. And then if they scroll to the bottom of that, we're going to offset by 500 now, because each time that they scroll to the bottom, we're going to load another 250 results. So it just depends what you're working with. Um, there are certainly real world examples of that where I've created something where I thought my boss was going to create 10 or 20 things in the database. And then he goes, oh, by the way, the software's running really slow every time that I go to this page. And I open it and he's created 1,000 different things. And I'm like, well, I never intended, I had no idea that you were going to create that many things. And that's when you start optimizing with an offset of saying, hey, when this first loads, we only need the first 10 items or the last 10 items that got created, or the most used 10 items or 100 items. And then if you need anything more than that, we're either going to put in a next page button, or we're going to make it so that when you scroll down to the bottom, the next set loads. So that's what limit and offset are used for. Very good question. And usually not something that you run into in your capstone on first go, but definitely something that you could run into. For example, we had one student scraped an entire Wegmans website of all the items in a grocery store. And if you think getting started, oh, well, that's not too many items, right? They're just eggs. But then think about the egg aisle alone at a Wegmans, right? They're different size eggs. They're different quantities of eggs. You can buy a dozen eggs. You can buy 18 eggs. They're different suppliers of eggs. Now, all of a sudden, you searching for eggs is returning 100 results alone. And so there are times that you want to use that offset or limit to say, hey, just get me the first 20 eggs in the database. And if you still can't find the eggs that you want, the user could hit the load more button and get the next group from there. Would you use an offset if your page is taking too long to load? Yes, you could. Or if it's just scrolling infinitely and you want to be able to break it up into page numbers, that's also a another good use for it as well. So it's not only a loading issue, it can also be a too much information on one page info situation. And both of those are good for limit and offset as well. Any other questions?
Are we gonna cover like and between?
Um, so between is pretty easy, right? That's just a between is like a double if statement where you're saying where if it's bigger than this or small and smaller than this. So we won't cover that too much. And then a like is kind of similar to a regular expression if you've run into that in JavaScript, where it allows you to use a wildcard. A like is basically saying any text can come before this or after this with the percent sign at the beginning or the percent sign at the end. Like is very widely used for search queries, right? So if you have a search bar in the top right or somewhere on your page, you want to type something in, you want to take what they're typing in and execute that in a query. That is what like is used a lot for. And then databases have kind of learned from the rest of the industry that regular expressions are a dominant thing. And so Postgres and most variations of SQL also support searches by regular expressions. So we will be covering an example at some point in the next 3 weeks of how do I search my database. Not necessarily tonight, but at some point in some project, we will do a search example to show you how we use Sequelize, which we will be covering, if not Monday, on Tuesday, how to connect to the database, how to take something the user has typed in and then search based off of that. So we definitely will be covering search and we'll be using either like or a regular expression for that in Sequelize. Any other question? A lot of Terry's questions are being generated, I'm guessing, from the SQL Bolt homework. So if you are feeling like you've gotten exposed to SQL and you're feeling like you actually like SQL and could see a career in working with databases, which of course full stack web programming does work with databases, SQL Bolt is listed in the optional or extra credit homework assignments in Canvas. And it's kind of like a free code camp style kind of half free code camp, half Khan Academy of exercises in SQL that give you a little bit more exercises to practice your SQL. Totally optional for those, but if you are deciding that you're liking SQL and want a little bit more practice with it, you can definitely check out Bolt, which we have linked in the optional homework assignments. Okay. With all of that said, are you guys ready for the first night of full stack programming? We are going to make our first API for the first time ever. We have used other people's APIs. We have even played around with Node a little bit for the intro of JavaScript. We have played around with Node, we've played around with other people's APIs and getting that data integrated. We have learned how to build our own front ends with obviously HTML. We started with vanilla JavaScript. We've layered React on top of that, but we haven't connected all of that together to really make our own API and have that API connect to the database. So, our very first project we're going to do, we're going to set up our first backend, our first API. We're going to make a GET request to that API to make sure that we can access that information in the browser. And then we are going to rebuild our to-do application in React and make sure that we can take data that is typed in on the front end, send it to the back end, have the back end save it into the database via SQL, have our database be able to read that information and send it through to the back end, have the back end respond to the front end with a list of all the items in it, and display that on the front end. If that sounds like a actual shitload of little steps, it absolutely is. So this is a class that I highly encourage that you follow along because we're going to get everything set up. We're going to get Postgres running on your database. So if you are someone who has been learning by taking notes in the past, this is the one exception of classes where I say try and follow along in real time, ask lots of questions. We're going to get everything set up here. And all of these tiny little steps will eventually feel natural because we're going to do this over and over and over again, right? So this is just night one of it. We're going to run into hurdles. We're going to run into things that aren't working. That is okay. We're going to work through it together. Just like React felt overwhelming, just like getting your HTML started felt overwhelming at some point. Just with more practice, this is going to feel natural. The other thing I will say is we start projects from scratch way more than we do than you would at pretty much any other company, right? Even if you're doing contract work, which is a lot of projects from scratch. So 99% of the time when you get hired at a company, you're not going to come in on day one and they're going to be like, this is what we need, go build it from scratch. They're going to instead say, this is the tool that we've been using. We need you to add this feature to it. Or they're going to say, hey, we don't have control of this tool. We need you to build an integration on top of it based off of something that already exists. So this constant routine of starting out from scratch is not something that you're going to be doing day to day when you get your job, especially as a junior developer. Oftentimes, a senior developer, that is their job to say, hey, I need to pick a stack. I need to research the tools. I need to make sure the requirements are documented. I need to do the process planning, which is what we covered last night. I need to plan out the database, all of that kind of stuff. With all of that said, the best way of getting started as a full stack developer is not dropping something in your lap that you don't understand. It's actually starting from square one. So that is what we are going to do tonight. This is window overload, and this is the very last thing that we cover, other than obviously deploys in the career week. We have reached the end of skills. You guys know all the JavaScript. You guys know how to work with React on the front end. You've been exposed to SQL on the database side of things. Now it is just a matter of that very last skill, other than DevOps and the career week, which are also still very important. But we have now reached the genesis of all the languages. You have exposure to all of them. Now it's just a matter of tying them together. And hopefully you're feeling that in your capstone as well of my front end is in a good place. I've started using React, which is making it more efficient. I've started looking into the data layer of all of the information that needs to display in my capstone. Now that final piece is saving it in a database and interacting with my very own API to update that data. And so that's where we are headed into tonight. With all of that massively overhyped, does anyone have questions on anything that I have covered up until that point? I say stalling as I pull up my reference code to make sure I know that I can match the hype that I am pitching. Um, 1 second, I'm almost there, and then we can dive in. Okay. So we've done a to-do list app already. We are going to need to do a front end. We are also going to need to do a back end that's saving all of that information. So we're going to do those both from scratch. I am going to go ahead and fire up. I think the back end is a more fun place to start. So I'm going to go into my code folder. I'm going to create a new folder. Where are we? We're in week 17. So go ahead and create your week 17. I'm going to make a new folder called day 4 inside of my week 17. And then I'm going to create two different folders in there. One is going to be for my front end. The other is going to be for my back end. Now, it's important to note here that some developers prefer their front end and back ends to be in the same folder. And there really isn't a consensus of one being better than the other. So in careers and code, we separate them out because Nathan and I both agree that it's easier to deploy when the front end and back end are separate. So because our front end is going to be generated by React, we're going to let React create the front end folder. But when we generate a back end, we have to make that folder by hand. So that's what we're going to start with. So I'm going to make a new folder, and I'm going to call this to do dash backend. No spaces in your file names or your folder names. Trust me, you will thank me later. I'm going to go ahead and pop open the terminal. Command space, type in terminal, or you can go into your applications folder, find terminal in the utilities folder. Either one is fine. I'm going to go over to my terminal and cheat by typing in cd space, and I'm going to drag over the to-do folder and hit enter. I can run my pwd or print working directory to see the path to make sure I am in the right folder. I am, so that's good. And now I'm going to run a command, npm init, I-N-I-T, short for initialize. And then I'm going to go ahead and type -y. That is going to create a package.json file for me. And what the -y is doing is it's saying use the default fields, right? So when it asks you all of these different questions about what's the name of your project, what's the main file to get this all started, all of that kind of stuff, instead of having to manually enter all that information, the -y is saying just use the defaults. Okay, now that I've got my to-do backend, I'm going to take that whole folder, drop it into VS Code, and I promise you guys lots of windows tonight. Tonight's the first time we are going to have two live shares going because we have our front end and back end that we need to keep track of. So we're going to focus on getting our back end up and running first. Then we're going to get our front end working. We're going to make sure our front end can talk to our back end. And then we're going to get into the database connection from the back end or our API server into the database itself. So inside my backend, all I have is my package.json. So I need to create a new file, and I'm going to call that index.js. Sometimes people call this server.js or main.js or script.js. Any one is really fine. Now, inside my index.js, I need to pull in a framework that we use called Express. Express is a framework that runs in Node. So just like Bootstrap is a HTML and CSS framework for components, Express is a framework for Node that makes it easier to make our own API servers. So what we do is we say const express equals require express. Require is a somewhat older okay, let me go back a second and repeat those steps. So I created my week 17 folder. I went into a new terminal window and typed in CD, and then I dragged in my week 17 folder to get that path in there. From there, I created my day 4 folder and CD'd into that day 4 folder. Then I did my npm init space -y. And the npm init -y is what creates the package.json file for me. From there, I oh, sorry, there's one more folder that I created. My bad. CD into my to-do -backend folder, enter on that, and then I ran my npm init -y. Grab that to-do backend, take that folder, drag that into VS Code, and we should see our package.json in there. We created a file called index.js. In that index.js, we say const express equals require express. Now, there are two different ways of importing files. In React, we're using the newer version. That is called the ES6 module import system. So we say import express from express. Node by default is still using the older import system, which is called the CommonJS module system. That, instead of using import and from, uses a variable and the keyword require. So we will see down the road of how we can basically tell React to use the ES6 module system, use the newer system. But for right now, we are using the older system, the CommonJS system, because that's what it defaults to. So we're going to say const express equals require express. From there, we can set up our very first API server. In order to do that, we are going to say const server equals express, and we call express as a function. I'm going to take a break in 1 second, but I want to make sure we have something to test before we take that break and help you guys through some of these steps. Once we have our Express server working, we need to do two more things. We have to create our first endpoint so the server will be able to respond to information, and we need to tell the server what port to listen on for those endpoint requests coming in. So the first thing we do is we say server.get. The first parameter that server takes is the path of the endpoint. Basically, where are we requesting it to respond to information on? Then we get two pieces of information. We get a request and a response. Oftentimes, these are shortened down to rec and res, but for the sake of being explicit and very verbose on our first endpoint, we're going to full out name those request and response. Then that information comes in to a function. And this function is going to do whatever we ask it to every time that request is made. So I'm going to console.log, we got our first request. And what are we going to do when that request comes in? We are going to response.send back something. And the easiest thing, or the most traditional thing to send back, is hello world. Ironic that I was wearing that shirt yesterday. Probably should have waited to wear that today. And finally, what we're going to do is we're going to tell the server, hey, server, you need to listen. You need to listen for some incoming requests. Where are you going to listen on? You're going to listen on port 3001. Why 3001? Because our front end defaults to 3000. So we don't want it listening on 3000. That's going to interfere with our front end. So we throw 3001 in there. Listen takes a second parameter, just like our server.get does, and it will basically tell us when the server is listening on 3001, what would you like me to do? And I'm going to console.log out here, server listening on 3001. That means when I start up my server and it doesn't log out server listening on 3001, I know there's some error somewhere I need to solve. Okay, we're almost at the finish line. 1.5 more steps to do to see if all of this is working and to test. If it isn't working, I'm going to leave plenty of time for questions and help work you guys through why it isn't working. So I'm going to right click over on the left side here. I'm going to open an integrated terminal. That is going to fire up my terminal down here at the bottom. And I'm going to type in node index.js. And it gives me an error message. And if I'm looking at this error message, it looks like it's really ugly because there's all of this module load CJS. I got no clue what all of this is trying to tell me. But if we start up towards the top, it says, okay, CJS is short for CommonJS. And the first thing that I really understand in this error message, the part that's English to me, is saying cannot find module express. Does anyone know what that is trying to tell us? The hint I will give you is NPM is what is managing our modules. We have to install Express. Austin, you hit the nail on the head there. Express is not something that just works out of the box. Well, even, in fact, Node isn't something that works out of the box. But we already installed Node onto our computer weeks and weeks ago, right? And part of Node is NPM, Node Package Manager. So what we need to do is install Express into this package, into this project, because every time we run npm init, what we are basically doing is setting up a package.json file that is keeping track of the dependencies, the packages for this particular project. So whenever we use Express, we aren't installing Express on the entire computer like we do for Node. Instead, what we are doing is installing a very specific version of Express for this project. So every time that we start a new project that is going to be using the Express framework, we need to install it. Just like every time that we use Bootstrap, we need to include that into our project. So we're going to come back down to our terminal and type in npm install Express. And that's going to take a second to do. You're going to see our node modules is now a folder. You're going to see this package lock.json that's keeping track of all of the dependencies that have gotten installed inside our node modules. Now we have our Express installed. We're going to try our command again. We're going to try node index.js in the terminal and hit enter. If everything is working, we should not only get a server listening on port 3001, we can also head into our web browser and navigate to localhost 3001. If we hit enter on that, we should see our hello world. If you see hello world, Congratulations, you have made your very first API on your own. We haven't connected to a database. We're not doing anything fun or special yet. But with these 10-ish lines of code, 12 lines of code, we have created our very first API in Node. If you do not see Hello World in the browser, or we did a step and you are defucking over why did we do that step? What was that step doing? Now is the time to ask. I never said our classes were made for kids, did I? All right, I'm not that good of a teacher. I know attendance is a little light tonight, but did everyone really make it to Hello World in the browser? No? Terry, where are you at?
Yeah, I got a reference error on
Okay,
mine.
share your screen. Let's work through it.
Yeah, hang on.
Okay, response is not defined. Go ahead and take me to your code and give me a remote. Do we? Okay, we just had to restart, and I'm going to cover that in a second. But you had actually fixed the issue. So you had either misspelled response here or here, and you already fixed the issue, but the server isn't live rebooting. So we're going to cover that in 1 second. But to fix it, I just hit Control C to stop the server and then hit Up Enter, and that restarted the server. And then when I refreshed in the browser, it fixed the problem. So you were able to fix it on your own. You just didn't know that you had to restart it. And we're going to cover the restart in a second.
I got the same error.
Okay,
You
share your screen.
said up arrow. Sorry.
Control C, click in the terminal.
Yeah.
Control C to stop the server.
Yeah.
Up Enter to restart the server. And then refresh in the browser to see if you still have the same problem.
Yeah, I do. I'll share my
Okay.
screen.
Yep, go for it.
Oh,
You have respond, and I'm guessing you have response in your code.
yeah. I did spell this one wrong at first. Oh, here you are.
Okay. In your terminal,
Mm-hmm.
you did a Control C to stop it. Do an Up Enter to restart it. Up arrow key, enter. Okay, now you have cannot find mod. Did
Oh.
we not npm install Express?
Oh, I restarted my terminal.
No, you should have Express installed. Yeah, otherwise you wouldn't have had node modules and all that stuff. What is going on? Let me you did give me a remote already. No, not that. Node index.js.
I got a comma where I should have a dot
Where?
in index.js. Like in the
Line?
last path. Like here. I think Just because I typed that node
Oh,
index
you
dot.
know what? Yeah, you're right. It should be node index.js. And now it's saying it's already in use because we've got a hidden terminal hanging out over here. So if I delete that one and we are only working in this one, now it fires up
Hmm.
and we can request and you're good to go.
Why does it look like that?
The hello world look like that?
The pretty print. What is that?
That's just trying to make the JSON look prettier.
Oh, is that just built into my browser?
It's either built into your browser or you installed an extension for it at some point.
I think maybe the React extension is doing that.
Oh, it could
That's
be.
what I
Yeah.
have. Okay. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, now we run into a point where like you may have run into that with React, where React is like something's already running on this port. Do you want it on another port? And you hit the Y button in your terminal and it will change a port. Node doesn't have anything like that built in. So Node is a lot pickier. If it says something else is running on that port, it won't let you like hijack the port or anything. It's like, nope, you figure it out on your own. So that is something that you'll run into for sure. Okay, we've already run into a problem, and there is a pretty easy solution around it. Let's go. Well, first, we see our hello world here. That's what we expect to see here, right? In our hello world. But if I pop open my console, I don't see we got our first request. Where is that hiding out? Well, in Node, our console is now separated out. The back-end console is going to show up in the terminal compared to the front end, our React code is still going to show up in the browser. So if we take a look, we can actually see in the terminal over here, we did get our server listening on 3001. We also got our first request showing up in that terminal. And the kind of cool thing here is if we refresh this in the browser, we can see we got our first request showing up in the terminal again. So now we got to keep that in mind when we are debugging, when we're trying to figure out what's going wrong. When we do a console log in any of our backend code, it's not going to show up in the browser. It's actually going to show up in the terminal over here instead. Okay, cool. That's good to know. But what if I modify my hello world? What if I throw in some additional information? So I'm going to throw in favorite animal is a dog. So I save that file. I see that it's saved. I come back over to my browser. I refresh. And the world does not know on my front end that my favorite animal is a dog. Well, it turns out that the Node server by default does not automatically reboot whenever we change our code. That's actually something really cool that Create React app does for us. Create React app is making it so whenever our code changes, it causes it triggers the browser to refresh that new code. But that's not happening over here in our terminal. The way that we fix that is with a package called nodemon. And nodemon will make our server auto reboot. Well, we can do it by hand if we go into our terminal and hit control, not command, but actual control on your keyboard and C, that will stop the server from running. That's a really important command or keyboard shortcut to know as a developer. So if we hit Control C in our terminal, we'll see that it brings us back to a line that's allowing us to run another command. Now in there, we could do node index.js again. That tells us our server is listening. We go back to our browser and we refresh, and now I get my favorite animal as a dog. Okay, good progress, but I want to be able to auto have my server restart. In order to do that, we are going to type in a command, npm install. I've already installed Express. We are now going to install another tool called NodeMon. So we bring in a little Jamaican help here. Yo, it's NodeMon. It's gonna automatically restart the. No, I'm just kidding. NodeMon is short for Node Monitor. It's going to monitor our files, and whenever it sees that the server has changed, it will automatically restart it for us. So I believe what we can do is type in npx for node package executor instead of monitor. And we're going to type in nodemon and hit enter. And that should still tell us our server is listening, but it also says this thing up here that it says it's watching paths star.star, which is basically saying a wildcard, and it's monitoring for JavaScript files and a couple other data formats it's watching here. So now I'm going to go up to my favorite animal is a dog, and I'm going to change it to an elephant. And the second that I save that file, look at what happens in the terminal. It says restarting due to changes, starting node index.js, server listening on 3000. Now, without having to reboot my server, without having to touch my terminal, if I come back over to my browser and refresh, I now have elephant showing up as my favorite animal.
But
Okay,
NodeMon doesn't want to install. I don't know if I'm spelling it wrong. At first, I did spell it wrong.
NODEMON, all one word.
Yeah. See, I spelled it wrong up here, but then I tried 3 more times.
What's the error?
Nothing. It's just clicking to the next line, but nothing's happening.
And you did npm space install space nodemon?
Mm-hmm.
Share your screen.
Oh, I'm not sharing it?
Oh, you are. Sorry.
Oh.
Stupid tabs. One of these days I'll learn. Okay. I'm glad you ran into this. It is not doing it because your node server is still running. So the terminal isn't expecting any additional inputs because it's focused on running node. So before we can do any other commands, we have to do Control C to
Oh.
stop the node server from running. Now you can npm install your nodemon.
Oh, thank you. And then there was a second thing too after that. Something about
Now
3000.
you can do npx nodemon, enter. And now you can go check in your browser and you should get some whale action going on.
How do you know? Oh, you read it. Thank you.
Okay. So that's super helpful, but kind of annoying, right? Because when we start up our React projects, whenever we start React, all we have to do is npm start and it just works. Wouldn't it be nice if we could tell npm, hey, the way to start our project is firing up nodemon? We actually can. If we go over to our package.json, there's this area called scripts. What we're able to do is throw a comma at the end of the test line and add in a new key called start. And we tell our project, hey, the way we start is by npx nodemon. Now we can save our package.json file. We can Control C to stop the terminal. And now we can run the command npm start, and you will see in your terminal that it has started back up using nodemon because we told npm, hey, when the start command comes in, what we really want you to do is go run this command npx nodemon. Okay. Now we've got Node Monitor installed. It's listening for changes. We've got our index.js set up. We are pulling in Express here, which is a framework in Node for building APIs. We set up our API server. And then it's really important in here, we want to understand what all of this is doing. Server is telling it, hey, this is related to Express. The .get is our method, right? So what other methods have we seen with APIs? We've seen get, we've seen post, we've seen put, we've seen patch. I don't know why there's so many P's there, but there we are, right? We've seen delete, we've seen all of those methods. One of the methods, the default method that the browser uses is get. Then we come into the first parameter, and that is the path of the endpoint. This happens to be at the root. We're saying, hey, if there's no path specified, use this endpoint. We're going to see different endpoints coming in here in 1 second. Then we get two pieces of information. The request, the data coming into the server, and the response, what should we send back based off of the information coming in. We don't use the request here at all yet. We definitely will be, because the front end will be sending in some information as part of the request. We also have the response, right? What are we going to send back for that request? Now we have a function in here where we have access to both the request and the response. We are able to send some data to our console, and we send back in the response this object. This object happens to be coming back as JSON, JavaScript object notation. We're sending back hello world and some other piece of information here, our favorite animal. Then we tell the server, hey, none of that is going to work unless you are listening for requests coming in on port 3001. If you are listening for requests successfully, go ahead and console log out that our server is listening on 3001. We can test that by going over to the browser, refreshing the page. And then the last thing we did is we know that if we run this script in Node directly, it will not monitor for any changes. So we installed npm node mon as a package. And then we told npm, hey, when we run this start command, when we say npm start, what I really want you to do is use npx node package executor to execute nodemon itself. That now is looking for any changes. It says it's listening on 3001 because we told it to log that out when it was listening. And finally, when we hit our endpoint in the browser, we got out our first request. One of those things that it's like, it makes sense when you're saying it all right now, and it made sense when we're doing those steps, but let's take a step back. Now that we see this, the require may be a little funky, right? But we're still in JavaScript. We're still running some code on our computer. The difference is instead of seeing the results maybe directly in our browser, instead we're making a request to see the response of all of that. Do we have any questions up until this point? There is absolutely zero shame if you got stuck on step number 2 and were afraid to ask for help then. Any concepts here that don't make sense so far?
Wait, if we're making a request, why is request in the server .get is still like not being used?
Because we're not using the data in the request yet. All we're doing is we're saying, no matter what the request is, no matter what happened, just send back the response, hello world, favorite animal, elephant. So if we actually change our console log here and add in the request itself and refresh our request, you can see a buttload of information comes out in the terminal. Let's see if I can find. So part of it is like, this is the original URL that came into that request. You can see I'm trying to find something else that's useful in here. There's a timeout in here that says, hey, if we don't respond to that request in the first 300,000 milliseconds, that request is going to time out. There is other information in here, like the method of the request, which happens to be a GET. We're going to dive into this and use part of the request, in particular the body, later in class tonight. But the reason why it was initially grayed out before I put that in there is we're basically saying no matter what the request is, as long as that request was a GET request coming to this endpoint, go ahead and just send back a response to it. So we will see slightly later in class how we use that request data in order to modify what is coming back in the response. Any other questions? Feeling pretty good about this? Joe and Safi, I feel sorry for you guys joining late because there were lots of little steps to jump to this point. So if you are joining late, I recommend you just take some notes. And then when you rewatch the video, more things will click because we are doing our first full stack setup. So far we've set up the server, but setting up the server is not code alone. There are a lot of commands we need to learn to run in the terminal, which is lots of little steps basically up until this point. Okay. I realized there were things in the chat. Just rewatch, followed in C5, so this is a refresher. Awesome. Okay. Got our backend set up. What we don't have set up is the connection to the database and our front end. So before we get into the database, let's get our front end set up to the point where we know that our front end is talking to our back end, and then we can do the database from there. So let me just okay. So this is just a quick little diagram to show you where we are at. We are at our server and Express, right? We've got this up and running. What we will eventually need to do is say, hey, the front end is going to send a request to Express. Express is going to go get the data from the database. The data from the database is going to flow back to our Express server, and our Express server is going to take the data from the database and send it to the front end. That's what our goal is. We're going to work our way up to that, and then I'm going to have a more complicated diagram that's going to show you how all of that is working. Okay. Let's get our front end set up. So I'm going to head back to Finder. I'm going to go to my desktop. I'm going to go into my C6 My Code, into my week 17, into my day 4. I'm going to head back into my terminal. I'm going to cd space and go into my day 4 folder. Now, really important to remember this. When we set up our backend, we have to make the backend folder ourselves, cd into the backend folder, and then run npm init. What is different about the front end is when we run create React app, it creates the folder for us. So keep in mind when you're setting up all of these projects, we manually create the backend folder, then run npm init inside the folder. But when we run create React app is going to create the folder for us. So we want to be inside the folder that the front end will be created in, compared to the back end where we have to create the folder ourselves and be inside of it before we run npm init. So inside our day 4 folder, make sure you're inside the day 4 folder. Make sure that you are not inside the backend folder. Make sure you are not only inside the week 17 folder. Make sure you are in day 4 itself by PWD, and make sure that day 4 is the last thing that comes out. We do not want to be inside the backend folder. Whipping lashings coming your way for anyone who is inside the backend folder before they run this command. So PWD, make sure you are inside your day 4. If you are absolutely certain that you are inside of that, now we can create our React app. So we're going to npx create React app, and we're going to call this to do dash very originally front end. I'm going to repaste the live share for the backend code for anyone who is joining us a little late. And then I'm going to go into Finder. I'm going to grab my to-do front end, and I'm going to open that up in VS Code as well. So I like to always have my front end code on the left side and the back end code on the right side. You guys have the additional challenge of having my live shares, both of them open, and your 2 versions of the front end also up and running as well, or front end and back end. So you want to be careful of managing your windows here. This is the peak, and it will be this way until the end of the program, the peak amount of windows that you will have open that you have to juggle around. So don't forget, you have like virtual desktops. If you swipe up with 3 fingers, you may want to use multiple desktops to keep track of the code. Whatever it is totally fine. Terry, you have a question?
Yeah, I already like created my to do front end while using the terminal. Should I like delete the folder then like okay.
Delete the folder and then let React recreate it. Yes. Okay. Once we get happy hacking, we are done with the OS level terminal. We'll do everything else in VS Code. So I'm going to come over to my terminal here and close it out. It's a good question, Joe. I'll come back to that in a second. Inside my to-do front end, I'm going to right-click, open an integrated terminal. Inside my terminal, I'm going to npm start or npm run start, both do the same exact thing. I should get my spinning React logo, and we are good to go. So you can go ahead and close out of your localhost 3001. We're all set on that one. We should only have React open in the browser. And last thing I'm going to do, I'm sending the front end live share your way now. Joe asked a question of when we import Express, why did we like name it Express, or why do we have to call it here? The answer to that is because one folder or one code base can actually have multiple Express servers running on different servers. So theoretically, we could create something that was like server 1 equals Express and server 2 equals Express, and have server 1 and server 2 listening on completely separate ports, but inside the same repository. So we can call Express anything here as long as we are consistent of calling it by that same function there. But it is naming convention. Some people don't call this server. Some people call this app. And then they do app.get and app.listen 3001. I'm not sure what the official Express documentation says, but it doesn't really matter, again, what we call Express as long as we are consistent here and here. And it doesn't matter what we call server as long as we're consistent on every single endpoint that we call here. Express does matter here because that's what's actually pulling in the NPM package. So we need that to be there as well. So I think I've seen app more than I have seen server, but in terms of teaching bootcamp students, server is the name that kind of makes more sense to me, and what I have started using in my code. But the reason why we don't just say express.get is because we could have multiple instances of a express server. Hopefully that answers your question. Okay. So let's do some work in. No, you should not close the back end because we need the back end running so that we can access it in the front end. So we actually have two servers running right now. We have our Express server running on 3000, and then we should have our backend server running on 3001. So those are intentionally on separate ports so we can access both of them. So you should not have your backend closed. No, Joe, because you don't get an instance of a Express server without calling this function. So Express, you have to actually call itself in order to get access to everything. You got to execute the function basically. And as far as I know, there's no shorthand to do that. Actually, no, there is a shorthand. Everyone else don't pay attention to me. What you could actually do, Joe, is combine these into two lines and say const server equals require express and then call express directly. So you could do that. That's yeah, I don't like that. And this also will not work with ES6 modules when we switch over. This will work with CommonJS modules. So I wouldn't encourage you to do that. I would encourage you to break it out into two lines, but you could do it as one. Could you see the gears returning as I was trying to remember how you can do it as one line? Okay. All right. Let's get our front end able to see that my favorite animal is an elephant. So I'm going to go into my app.css. I'm going to delete out everything in my app.css without deleting the actual file. I'm going to go into my app.js. I'm going to go ahead and delete out my entire header. And with React, we have seen making an API call directly in the function isn't a good idea because we only want that API call to happen when the function or when the component or the functional component first loads. So the way we do that is with a use effect. Use effect takes two things. It takes a function, and as the second parameter, it takes an empty dependency array to say only do this when the page first loads. UseEffect doesn't like async being passed in as the first parameter. So instead, we make something that says make API call, which is going to be an async function. And then we call that async function after we create it. Now you got to go make that call. So we say const res, the response, let's call it response, let's be explicit with it, is going to await a fetch to, and we're going to say localhost 3001. Localhost is the equivalent of typing in 127.0.0.1, both of which are special IPs or names for basically saying go to my local computer, just so happens to be on port 3001. Then, once we get that data, parse the data by awaiting a response.json. And finally, console log that data out. Delete my import because that's going to bother me for the logo. I save that. I come over to Chrome. I refresh, and I get this lovely failed to fetch. I'm going to pause here, let you guys catch up. But it is expected at this point to get an error message. You should see in your browser, once you get this code in, failed to fetch. If you have any other error other than failed to fetch, you should not, you have a problem and you need to debug or ask for help.
I do not have an error.
Check in your console. Do you have an error in your console, but not in your browser page area? Do you make sure you have your make API call being called underneath the function itself?
I was in 3000, not 3001.
Ah, yes, you do need 3001 here because we are making the request to the back end, not to the front end. And if you still don't have an error, share your screen and we can take a look.
I guess I can drag it.
Joe, that's a loaded question, so I'm gonna wait to respond to you on that one. I'm not ignoring you. Okay, switch your localhost 3001 to 3000. Because we want to be running the front end in the browser. Okay, the other problem you have is the one that I thought you might. You defined the function make API call, but then you never told it, hey, actually go make the API call.
Oh. Oops.
So that we throw in there. And now if we switch back to Chrome, you have the error failed to fetch and you're all caught up.
Thank you.
Of course. Does anyone else not have a failed to fetch? Yep. You got it, Michael.
Me. I have
Okay.
something that says my use effect is not found. Oh, it's because I didn't import my use effect.
Sure is. Okay, you are on 3002. I'm guessing because your capstone is running in the background somewhere. That's okay. Just know that when we do the next step, it's gonna be 3002 instead. But front end KPI call, not valid JSON, your back end response sending, server getting.
She forgot the two dots near await fetch with the HTTP.
Ah, good call. There you go. You're up to date, Michael.
I'm not gonna lie, I'm a little surprised I got that.
Always a good feeling when you beat me to it. And a good feeling for me as well, believe it or not, because it means my students are learning and able to debug as well. So kudos all around. Okay, anyone else not have a failed to fetch in the console?
Fix my error.
Awesome. Okay. Almost at break time, but we do have a problem here, and this is one of the most annoying errors ever. Because oftentimes when we're working in the with backends, we get this error message about cores, and we go down this long rabbit hole to try and fix cores and realize that the problem isn't actually with cores itself. It's something wrong in our backend, or the front end's just getting a response that it doesn't expect, or all kinds of weird stuff. However, this is a time that the issue is actually legitimately cores. We scrolled up a little bit. It says failed to fetch. okay, but why did it fail to fetch? If we scroll up, it says failed to load resource, and we're like, okay, we know that you failed to fetch some resource, and we keep going up, and it says access to fetch at 3001. So now we got to keep numbers in our head. 3001 is the back end, 3000 is our front end. 3001 is our back end, is saying from origin 3000, our front end has been blocked by cores. Then it goes on to say no access control allow origin has been set on the requested resource. If an opaque response serves a resource, go ahead and try and do this no cores thing. Don't try the no cores thing. It's not going to do what you think it's going to do. Does anyone remember going all the way back to Ryan's module what cores is? Or what it even stands for?
Isn't it like a set of rules to make sure we're using API requests correctly?
Basically, yes. Yeah.
I don't
It's
know what it stands for, though.
cross-origin resource sharing is cores. And it is the bane of every full stack developer's existence. What cores basically does is it is trying to set up and it's trying to close a security loophole to say that our backends should only be able to be accessed from front ends that we specifically authorize. Sounds like a good idea in theory, but the whole point of an API is that it can share information. Well, it turns out APIs, when they're talking to other servers, don't give a shit about cores. And so we can use cores API to API, no problem. But the second we get browsers involved, the second that we get front ends involved, the API puts up this wall of security and is like, yo, we don't want to share that data. And if you're like, but you'd share that data with any other server, they're like, yeah, other servers are cool. They get into the club, right? But if you're trying to access this API with a front end, you're not cool. You're not allowed into the club. So what we need to do is go over to our backend, our server, and tell it, hey, dumbass, we're making an API so our front end can access it. Let's put the front end on an allow list and basically say our backend is allowed to be accessed in our front end. That's going to come back to bite us when Nathan comes in and deploys and you have a different domain. But for now, here's how we do that. We're going to switch back over to our backend code. In our backend code, we need to stop the server because we need to add in a new NPM package. So when we are over in Node, we can't just type in npm install cores here. We hit enter on it, it does nothing. We can't issue a new terminal command until we stop our server first. So we're over in our server. We're going to control C to stop. We're going to npm install a package called cores, C-O-R-S. No, it's not the beer I'm drinking. It is a package we need to install. Now that we have cores installed, we don't want to forget to restart our server. So we're going to npm start again. That is going to get our server running. And then we need to tell Express to use cores. So up at the top here, right underneath my const express, I'm going to pull cores in. I'm going to say const cores equals require cores. That is importing it into the npm package. Now that I have access to the package, I'm going to come underneath my server and I'm going to say, hey, server, use this package called cores. And if we save that, we go back over to our front end. Our front end does not have any context that we just turn the mountains blue on the can. What we need to do is refresh the page. We should get a white page now. And we should see our data now in the console. And it's normal to see it 2 times. That's a consequence of the dev environment. So just like that, we have made our first full stack call. Full stack with an asterisk. We don't have the database working yet. That's okay. We do have data going from our front end to our back end, making the request. The request is received on the back end, generating a response and sending it back to the front end. And the front end is now displaying that data in the console. That's pretty cool. Still have to do our database. Let's go ahead and take a moment here and do attendance. And then I will answer any questions if this is not working. The attendance word tonight will be cores, because I am very unoriginal, and that is a good keyword for tonight's class. CORS. If you spell it like the beer, I will throw a beer at you, because Coors is just terrible, terrible beer. 1 O, please. Yes, it's cool that the mountains turn blue on the can, but you know what else what else is also cool? Craft beer. Go ahead and submit your attendance, and then pause here for any questions before we go on break.
Yes. My
Shoot.
app crashed. It says app crash, waiting for file changes before starting.
Okay, it's usually a syntax error on the back end. Go ahead and share your screen.
At first I spelled course wrong, but then I repaired it. So you think I need to restart my server?
You were not requiring, you were required.
Okay, let's see it now.
Refresh. Good to
Yeah,
go.
yes. Shouldn't I say stuff?
Pop open the object and you'll see it.
Oh. Thank you.
Of course. Any other questions? Yes, Michael. Oh, you are. Oh, there we go.
Yeah. No change. I saw it failed to fetch.
Okay. Did you refresh in the browser?
I did.
Okay, share your screen. Let's take a look. Only reason why I'm not sending you guys on break is these are very common errors to run into. So I want you guys to get exposure to figuring out how to debug, because now debugging becomes much more complicated. Now that we've got the front end and the back end working. So you've got all of this working, but you do have a module not found here. That module not found is usually because when you installed, you maybe didn't stop the terminal before you did it. So let's try that. Control C to stop. npm install cores. Start it back up. Refresh, and you're good to go.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
There's mine, unless you were waiting.
Everyone else can go on break, be back at 7:25, and I will answer your question, Joe. So keep calls in their respective component. I use the same call in 12 different places. Wouldn't it be better to stick it in its own component, call it once and store it, or store it in the first spot and use and pass it from there? So you have 2 answers for that. One answer is you can make the call, like a very common call to make is the user signed in, right? And you can make that API call all the way up in app.js or navbar.js, and then basically store the state in the parent and pass that state down to all of the child components. So yes, it is in general better to make that API call once and pass it down on the front end than it is to make that call 12 different times and all the different components that need it. There is something built into React called the context API, and that uses something called a provider, where you can basically, instead of having to pass it down in every single component, what you can do is you can load up that state up at the parent level and then use the context API to access that data without having to pass it down at every single level.
Right. I think we talked about that. Yeah, because I was thinking I'm like, shouldn't we be striving for, because it can be resource intensive on the server side and potentially like financially expensive to keep making those calls.
Correct. Yeah, so making the call once, storing it in state, storing the state in context, and then accessing the context multiple levels down is the correct way to do it. If, however, you are saying all I need to do is access it one level down or even two levels down, at that point you can just pass that state down via props. But if you are saying like, hey, this is the signed in user and I need access to the signed in user in 12 different components that are all different levels of nesting, it does make sense to use the context API at that point.
Right.
So you want to keep API calls scoped as small as possible. But sometimes there are global things, and when you have something global, the context API makes sense.
Okay.
Good, very good question. It's just what
Yeah.
not an
Yeah.
easy answer.
Right.
And if you are having problems with the context API, I feel like their documentation is a little vague, or like it doesn't give you the easiest or simple example of how to use the context API, which is basically storing state in a provider and then accessing that via a hook. So if you have any problems with it, ChatGPT it, and if you're still wrestling with setting it up, just let me know and I can give you a code example for it. It's one of those things that you can't, it's really hard to wrap your head around until you have it working. And then when you have it working, you're like, oh, why didn't they just explain it like this in the first place? So if you hit that point, let me know and I'm happy to help you through it.
All right. Yeah. I was mostly concerned about like, sign-in's a good example, but I was coming at it from like the point of like accessing like PHI,
Yep.
where you're authorizing the use of accessing the database for that, versus passing it through on the front end through props or calling it again.
Yep. And there's security you got to do on both the back end and front end side. User roles are a very common thing to have to enforce on the database, where basically before you make the database query to get the data, you make another query to make sure they're authorized to get that data. So like, hey, the user that signed in is authenticated as user ID 123, is patient 456 that they're requesting assigned to 123. And if they are, then make the query. Otherwise, send back not authorized.
Well, I got to add these to my ERD.
You do. Yes. There is normally a users table and a patients table that is usually separated out. And then there is usually a bridge table that's a many to many relationship, because many patients could be assigned to many users and many users may have many patients.
Right, for different care teams and whatever.
Correct. So that's a bridge table because it's or an association table or whatever they want to call it. That is breaking the many to many down to a one to many and a many to one. So it's just going to be an ID, a user ID, and a patient ID, and then based off of that table, you can figure out who's tied to who.
Shouldn't there also be a user role table which relates to the user, which relates to the patient? Or
It
I guess to the
depends.
bridge.
It depends if the patient is allowed to sign in as a user. Or are you asking something else?
I meant for like the someone on the care team to access the record.
Yeah, so at that point, it's just more rows in that table, in that bridge table. So you would say user 123 is associated to patient 1, and then you would do another row that says
Oh,
user 456 is also associated to patient 1 as a new row.
and if it can't pull from there, obviously that means there's no access, right?
Correct. If it can't
Gotcha.
find the row, then they're not. Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And then you also get into the fun of like, oh, but this user is an admin or like a manager. So now they're don't even bother checking the roles table. They're allowed to access all the data.
Right.
So that comes into play as well.
Gotcha.
Good luck. CH725.
Alrighty.
The front end is requesting the data. The back end is receiving the request, is generating a response, is sending that response back to the front end. However, we are missing the last piece of full stack, which is the database. In order to be able to connect to a database, we have to have a database server running. So there are two tools that we're going to use. One is called Postgres app. That is what is going to install our database and get the database up and running. So go ahead and download the app that I just put in the chat. It is completely free. And go head through that install process. Unfortunately, I cannot screen share through it because if I uninstalled Postgres, my other work profile on this computer would absolutely go crazy. So go through that install process, go ahead and download it. Once you have it downloaded, move it into the applications folder. Do not open it directly. You want to make sure that it is in the applications folder before you open it. Once you do open it from the applications folder, you can click the initialize button and you should see a screen that ultimately will end up looking like this. So as long as you eventually get to something that says PostSQL, don't worry about the version number. You will probably be on a newer version than I am, but it should ultimately say running. So you're going to download it. You're going to move it into the applications folder. You're going to open it. You're going to click the initialize button. And then ultimately you should see something that says running. And for the last time, just to be explicitly clear, do not open it right after you download it. Make sure you move it into applications before you open it. Anyone has problems, feel free to let me know. Once you get that installed, we are going to install one other application.
This is the universal one, right?
Great question. Yes, it is the universal. Once you have that downloaded, we are also going to install a program called Beekeeper. And so I'm going to throw that in the chat as well. Do not just Google Beekeeper. So two gotchas here. One is Postgres you don't want to open it directly from the download. You need to make sure it's in applications first. The second with Beekeeper is actually a paid application. But there is something called the Community Edition that is completely free that will not ask you for money. So you specifically have to use the link in the chat. Once you open that up, you can hit the skip to the download link right underneath the request for the email. And then you are going to download the macOS Apple Silicon version, the one that says ARM64. Unless for whatever reason you are on a Mac that is definitely an Intel processor. All of the laptops that we provide and all of the laptops that we cleared you guys to use are the Apple Silicon version. So unless you know for a fact you're on an Apple processor or not on an Apple processor, you're on an Intel processor, everyone else should download the Apple Silicon ARM64 version. Make sure that it does say Community Edition up at the top. You really want to make sure that it is the free one, because otherwise you will come sobbing to me in 30 days and say, my Beekeeper's broken. I can't get into my database. So make sure it has the Community Edition installed. I am going to start a poll, make sure that everyone has had an opportunity to download that. I know that the question says, were you able to get your code working? At this point, what you should have up is your Postgres SQL. Ignore the version number. It should say running. If it does not say running and you have an initialize button, go ahead and hit the initialize button. In Beekeeper, after you get it installed, you should have a screen that looks something like this, without the saved and the recent over on the left. If you've gotten to the screen that says new connection, you are good to go. So when you have both applications installed and both screens look like my screen, we are good to proceed. Go ahead and let me know in the poll. If you are stuck at any step along the way, let me know as well, and I can help you through that.
I have my Beekeeper, but it says demo database. Should I click new connection?
Yes. If you click new connection, does it give you the connection type, select a connection type drop down?
Yeah,
Cool. Then that's where you need to be.
thanks.
For Postgres, do we need to do step 3 to configure like the path, or
You do not.
Okay.
Okay to skip that step. Thank you for asking. I mean, you can do it if you want. It won't hurt anything, but we won't need it for anything in class. That's basically if you want to access Postgres through the terminal, but we'll be accessing Postgres through Beekeeper instead. All right, most of you guys are voted in. Does anyone need another minute or need help getting to this step? If your Beekeeper does not say new connection type, it is okay to click on the new connection button in the top left. Okay, we are going to roll forward that. So your Postgres will not look anything like my Postgres because I have a bunch of databases already created. However, you should see at least one database that has your username. So the username that I am signed into my computer is Hack Upstate. That is the information that you will need. I'm going to say this once because it will be a pain point for you for the next 3 weeks. The database name that I connect to is not going to be the same database name that you connect to. So whenever you see Hack Upstate in my code or in my Beekeeper, you have to remember to replace that with your username. Your username may have spaces in it. It may have capitals in it. It will probably not have those spaces or capitals in it in Postgres. So when we are looking at this Postgres app, go ahead and find whatever database name looks like your username. That is the information that we are going to be using to connect in Beekeeper. So what is actually happening here? Postgres, the app, is running the database server. A server is something that we connect to, right? We are about to see how to connect to it in our code, but we also need a database client to be able to see that before we're able to play around in our code and connect into it. So over in Beekeeper, click on New Connection, and it's going to say select a connection type. These are all of the different database types that Beekeeper supports. We are going to pick the Postgres option. Now, Postgres needs a couple pieces of information to connect. It needs the host name. We're going to leave that on localhost for now. We're connecting to our local computer. Port is 5432. We're also going to leave that the same. By default, Postgres runs on 5432, just like by default, React runs on 3000. We created our backend on 3001. We don't want ports colliding. Two things running on the same port gets real nasty real quick. So we leave 5432 on Postgres because that is the default over there. We are going to put in our username, whatever the username is that shows up in Postgres. So over there, I am going to type in personally HackUpstate. You are going to type in your username that shows up again over in the Postgres application. Password we're going to leave blank. Default database, we are going to also type in our username. And then we are going to hit the test button. It may give you a pop-up that says Beekeeper wants to connect to Postgres without using a password. That is totally okay. Go ahead and hit okay on that. And what you should get, other than them asking for money, is a little pop-up in the bottom right that says connection looks good. Does anyone, after hitting the test button, not get a connection looks good? Okay, that is a good sign. So before we do anything, we're going to come down into the save connection area, and we're going to name this local DB. And then go ahead and hit the save button there. That connection details will now be saved into your saved list over here on the left. After you name it local database or whatever you want to call it, hit the save button. Now over on saved, you can double click and that will open us into Beekeeper. Apparently I have a gazillion tabs open, so let me clear that out as well. Okay, we are now in Beekeeper. Beekeeper is a client, a user interface for a database client that is allowing us to connect into the database. By default, Postgres has created a default with our default database with our username. We don't want to do that though. We want to make our own database. So we're going to hit the little plus icon up here at the top, which is going to give us a text editor that is going to allow us to run a query. So in here, we are going to type in create database to do. We're going to throw a semicolon at the end and go ahead and hit the run button. You will probably get something that says query okay, 0 out of 0 results or something similar. You have now created your first database by running a SQL command. Now, one of the annoying parts of Beekeeper is that there are a gazillion refresh buttons everywhere, and they are all sometimes hidden. So if we come over here, there's a refresh button here. That's not the refresh button that we actually want, though. The refresh button we want is all the way up here. So go ahead and click on that refresh button. It won't look like anything happened, but we can now click on the dropdown, and you should have to do in that dropdown. Go ahead and click on to do.
I have an error.
Your
It
error
said
is
database to do already exists.
you've been
Okay,
following
so
along on another cohort there?
no, I've never done this before.
Cheers, Steve. Let's take a look.
I did. Did I do the
Oh.
right screen?
One day I will learn this.
Yeah, I did.
How do you already have a Postgres database named to do?
I don't know. I've never even heard of these things.
Oh, could it be maybe you just hit the run button twice?
Oh,
We're gonna run with that.
it's already like at the top. Is that it right here?
Yep, you're good.
Oh,
You switched into it, so you're good to keep following along.
okay.
Okay. Now we've created our first database. What's the next thing we probably need to do in our database?
A select query. Oh
What
no,
are we
make a
selecting
table.
from?
Make a table.
We have to make a table. So we are going to create table, and we're going to call it to-dos with an S at the end. Make sure you have the S at the end. And we then need to tell it the columns. So we're going to do a parenthesis at the beginning and the end. And we are going to come in here and say, all right, we probably need an ID. So we're going to say ID, and it is going to be an integer. We are also going to create the name of the task, which is going to be a varchar 255, which is the length of the name. And then we're also going to store completed, which will be a Boolean. And there's always, I can never do this from memory. We are going to do, instead of integer for the key, we're going to do serial. Serial will automatically generate the ID for us, so it will do one after the other. And then we're also going to flag that as the primary key as well. If we hit the run button, we are going to get an error that says create database cannot run inside of a transaction block. Does anyone want to take a guess as to why we're getting that error? Well, this is kind of a weird error. We already created the database to do. We're trying to create a table now. What's going on? Well, in Khan Academy, every time that we typed something, it moved us down. Yes, Austin, you essentially you're right. It's creating a database inside of a database. But what's going on here is we want this create table command to run. It's still trying to run our command create database. In Khan Academy, whenever we typed another letter into our command, it was running that command instantaneously. That is a terrible idea for any kind of production database. We only want it to run the commands when we're ready for it to actually run that SQL statement, right? Because again, there is no undo button. There is no, hey, I didn't mean to run that, or that SQL command did something I didn't actually want it to do. So this code isn't running until we actually hit the run button. The problem is that when we hit the run button, it is going to go ahead and run the entire script that we have written out here. And it's saying, well, we can't create a database called to do because to do is already created. So a couple ways we can solve this. We can highlight create database to do and comment it out with a command slash. Comments in SQL are a little different. It's a dash dash. We could say we've already created the database, so just delete that line out. That is also fine. Or we can come in here and just highlight those lines that we want to run. When we highlight those lines and hit run selection, it will give us a query that says no results. Okay, well, of course there aren't results. We didn't try to select anything. But if we look over here on the left, we now have a folder called to-dos. Well, that looks promising. If I open up my to-dos, I can see my very first table on our computer. Okay, kind of cool. Let's try and use it. So I'm going to go back into my query editor. Notice there are 2 tabs up at the top here. And I'm going to write some SQL and say insert into to-dos some values. And I'm going to insert I'm going to specify, because I want the ID to get generated for us. So I'm going to tell it, hey, I'm going to insert into the columns name and completed. And the values that I want to insert are connect my DB to backend. And that is completed false. Now I'm going to highlight just that insert into, because if I run the whole thing again, it's going to tell me it can't create table to-dos. To-dos is already created. So I can either comment those out or highlight just this section and hit run selection. And I do this every single time. I always forget if it's single quotes or double quotes. It's single quotes. So if I highlight that just one line, I run it, it says 1 row affected. We'll prove it. I'm going to go back over to my to-dos and it says no data. Well, we have now found the 3rd freaking refresh button in Beekeeper, because why can't we just have one refresh button that works everywhere? There's a refresh button down in the bottom right. If we hit that refresh button down there, you will see my very first task has been added to the database.
I do not have. Oh, wait, nope, sorry.
19th refresh button, did it? Okay. Anyone not see their data hanging out in the table?
Okay,
Terry.
actually,
Oh.
sorry. I
Austin.
don't have the refresh button in the bottom right.
Okay. Do you have to-dos over on the left?
Yes.
Double click on that.
Yep.
Does it show the data now?
Yeah, it's in there. Yeah. I
Oh, you just don't have
now
a
it's showing
refresh
up.
button?
It showed up after I went back to it. Never mind.
Okay.
It literally was not there and just popped up.
There are refresh buttons that even I have not found in Beekeeper Studio yet. So it's not you. It's kind of a quirky design. Terry, what's up?
Yeah, I got an error. Like there was a problem. Connect my DB to backend does not exist.
Check your syntax. Do you have single quotes around?
Oh yeah, it's the double quotes again.
Yeah, sorry. It's single quotes there. I can never remember. Backtick single quotes and double quotes mean something different in Postgres and JavaScript. I mean, backticks mean something a little different, but Postgres is very particular about its single or double quotes, and I don't use SQL enough to remember which one is which. My bad. Okay, anyone not see this in their table? Okay.
Wait, I have to hit the refresh button for that?
You can double click on the table name on the left, and that will open up another tab and refresh it. Or you can hit the refresh in the bottom right once you have the tab already open, and that will also refresh it.
Okay, I got it now.
Cool. Anyone not have this rocking and rolling over here? Okay. So we can close out of Postgres. Don't quit Postgres, but just close out of it. We can minimize Beekeeper for now. You can close out of the downloads for the Postgres app and the downloads for Beekeeper as well. We're going to go back to our backend code. We are not really allowed to ever connect to a front end, to connect to our database directly in the front end. So we need to relay the information. The front end is going to request the information. The back end is going to receive the request. The back end is going to ask the database for the data. The database is going to return the data to the back end, and the back end is going to send it to the front end. Full stack isn't complicated at all. I don't know why you would think that. So we've made the front end to the back end back to the front end, but now we got to layer the database into that. So we're going to go make sure you're in your back end terminal, not in your front end terminal, in your back end terminal. Control C to stop the server. The server is not running and you hit Control C, it also will not hurt anything. So that's a good way, kind of clear out anything that's running. And we're going to npm install our last package of the night called PG. 2 letters, PG. That is short for Postgres. Once we have that installed, I'm going to hit the up arrow twice or just type in npm start, hit the enter button there, and I should get back to my server listening 3001. If all of that is working, we can now connect to our database. So before or after my cores, but before my endpoints, I'm going to tell it, hey, DB is equal to, actually, before I do that, sorry, I got to pull in Postgres. So I'm going to say const PG equals require PG, which is unlike my language. Once I got my require Postgres in, I'm going to say const DB is equal to a new PG client. Make sure you have a capital C for client. And then we got to tell it how to connect. Well, we're going to connect to the database called to do. And finally, we've got to tell that database, now that it knows about the client, go ahead and connect. I'm going to save here. And I got a little pop-up that says Electron wants to connect to Postgres without using a password. Electron is the name of the framework that VS Code is actually built in. So I'm going to go ahead and hit OK on that one. And I'm going to look at my terminal. My terminal should have restarted, and we should say server listening on 3001. If we have an error at this point, we want to stop and fix the error because something is not talking between our backend code and our database itself. Could be a problem with the PG package, could be a problem with the syntax of creating the client, could be an issue with the connection, could be all different kinds of problems. So we want to stop here, save, look in our terminal. If you have server listening on 3001, we're good to go. If you have any error message now, speak now or forever hold your peace.
How do you restart the terminal again?
Control C to stop anything, and then npm start, or keep hammering that up button until you find the command you want, like npm start, and hit enter.
Thank you.
Terry.
With under like database to-do list, why you didn't do like user or like port? Because it like auto like corrected. Like, so I already had like the new PG client, but also give me like, you know, username, host, port.
You AI cheater. Yes. So Nathan's going to be covering all of that stuff by default. If you don't specify the port, it will assume to be 5432, which is what we're running on. If you don't specify a username, it will default to the username that you're trying to connect to. If you don't specify a password, it will assume it doesn't need a password to connect, right? So that is the case right now. The only thing that isn't the case is we're not connecting to the default database. We're connecting to the to-do database, which is why we specified that. If you needed. So once you deploy this, you're actually going to have two copies of your database. You're going to have a copy that's running on your computer, so you can do local development and not mess with anything that's out on the internet. But then you will have to specify things like the username, the password, the URL, the port, all of that stuff, because that's going to be deployed on some server on the internet. So we don't have to specify that now because we are using all the defaults. But as we get into more advanced database connections or connecting to other databases, we will either have to specify the URL, and the URL will include all of that information, or we will have to break it down into the username, the password, the port, the database name, the URL, the whatever else, all those different configuration options. Okay, any other questions? Anyone have an error in their terminal?
I have a question. Does
Yes.
it matter the order that we write this code in the backend? Like, for example, must we put the DB variable underneath the const server and a server dot use course?
Order matters, but yes, yes-ish is the answer. So, if we don't have these requires up at the top, then when we do something like Express to set up the server, it doesn't know where Express is coming from. So the order matters there. But does the order matter if I end up requiring PG first, Core second, and Express third? No, it's all pulling in those packages. So the order of those three doesn't matter, but those three need to come before I use them down here.
Okay.
The database, could I put the connect all the way down here? Yes. But if for whatever reason a GET request came in before the database was finished connecting, that could cause problems. The chances of a request coming in the nanoseconds it's taking to connect to the database is quite small, but non-zero. So the order kind of matters. Right, like we wouldn't want to tell a server to listen to incoming requests until it knows all of the endpoints, all of the requests that could be coming in. So this is a good habit to have the order this way. But you could definitely see someone say, well, before I even set up the API server, I'm going to connect to the database first and then do all of the API stuff second. That would be totally fine and allowed. So yes, order matters, but there is some flexibility in that order. Does
Thank
that
you.
make sense?
Yeah, it did.
Okay, so theoretically, we're connected to the database right now. But then I'm like, okay, well, prove it, right? Like it says we connected, but I don't see any data yet, right? That data's hanging out in Beekeeper and it's somewhere in our Postgres. Let's actually go get that data. So I am going to say, hey, I'm going to server.get my tasks. And this time I'm going to get an async rec res. So request and response are what those are short for. But naming convention typically uses rec and res just because they're a little bit shorter. So we can call them really anything, but exposing you to convention. We're doing async here because everything that we do, almost everything we do with the database is asynchronous. So just like when we do a fetch request, we have to either await or then the promise. The same goes for the database queries. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, we're going to make this variable called DB result. And the result is going to come from awaiting a DB query, the same DB that we connected to and set up a client for up here. And the DB query is going to select star from to-dos. We are then going to res.send back that entire DB result. I save that. I come over to my browser. I open up a new tab called 3001, and all I got is a favorite elephant. And I'm like, well, I don't give a crap about my elephant. I want my to-dos. Well, I'm not going to get my to-dos because I specifically made that endpoint to tasks. So over in my URL, I'm going to add /tasks to the end of my URL. And what I get back is a giant JSON object. Now, this is actually kind of cool, right? It's telling me, hey, here's some table information. The fields that came back were the ID, the name, and completed. It's given me an ID of the column I didn't even know existed. It's telling me this data type ID. No idea what that is. There's all of this weird built-in type stuff with an array parser. Kind of a lot of information. But the information that I care about is up here in my rows. My rows are showing me, hey, connect my DB to my backend. That is what I inserted into the database. That's pretty cool. So this is all I really care about sending back to the front end, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to modify my res.send a little bit, and I'm going to send back my tasks as my db result.rows. And if I save that and refresh over here, now I have my tasks coming back. Does anyone not have their tasks coming back in their browser?
Yes, I just have a blank screen.
Do you
Oh, wait.
have tasks as part of the URL up at the top?
Yeah, I had 3001. Sorry. I mean, not 3001. I had 3000 local hosts. That's why I couldn't tell. But it popped up. Thank you.
Cool. Very common thing that will happen from here on out is that you're accidentally hitting your front end instead of your back end. So good thing to keep in mind. I do it all the time as well. Wait until you have production and you're like, can't figure out why your code isn't running. And you're like, this console log is here. I know that this console log is here. And then you realize you're on the deployed version of your website instead of the local version of your website. Happens to me at least monthly. Okay. Got our tasks back, but this is on our back end. What I want to do is get our tasks showing up on our front end. So I am going to switch back over to my localhost 3000. I can go ahead and actually close out of my 3001. I only want to be on my 3000, which at this point is just a white screen with some information in the console. Okay. Let's do something with that. I'm going to go back to my front end code. And back in my front end code, I'm going to modify my fetch request to get my tasks. So I'm going to say /tasks at the end there. Now I'm going to save and make sure that's working. And indeed, I can see my tasks. But that data is sitting in JSON. I need to do 2 steps to show that to the user. Because this is data that's coming from an API, I need to store that in state. So I'm going to say const tasks and set tasks is equal to a use state that starts out as an empty array. And when I get my data back, I am going to set my tasks to my data dot tasks. Now I can't really see if that's working yet until I come down to my div class name app and I say tasks dot map to get each individual task. And what do I want to show up for each task? I would like a list item to show up with the task.name. And whenever we map over something in React, we need to add a key, and we can finally use an ID that the database has generated. Don't forget to add your import use state up here at the top if it did not auto import for you. I save, I come over, I refresh my page. I screwed up on something. Task name, tasks. Tasks. Oh, don't forget the return keyword there. That might help. And now I have connect my DB to my backend showing up. This is where we are going to stop tonight. No, I'm not ending class 23 minutes early. We're going to go through and document out all of these steps because obviously there's a lot going on in this code. So we're going to spend the last 20 minutes of class documenting that out, and I want to give everyone a minute to catch up here. Make sure that you are able to see your task in the front end. If you are, pat yourself on the back. You are now officially all full stack developers. Your front end is talking to your back end is talking to your database is returning data to your back end is relaying it to the front end, your front end is using that data in state in React to show that information. You have now created the same data flow that almost every web app uses. You now contain the information to create any kind of web app like Facebook or Instagram or any of that stuff, all of which are using this exact same stack. So on Monday, we will pick this up of, well, how do I add a task? How do I flow that into the database? We will also get practice with the chat application, and then we'll see a more efficient way of interacting with the database without having to use SQL. So that's all coming down the pipeline. But for right now, we want to understand these basic concepts before we add in complexity to them. So take a minute, make sure that this is showing up in the front end, make sure you don't have any errors. If everyone is good to go there, we will start going through and commenting all of this code out. Terry, you have a question?
I got an error on mine, but I'm gonna try to debug it a little bit.
Sorry, I kind of went out of order on this because I screwed something up somewhere. Make sure you have a return down here. Make sure your use state is an empty array. When you initialize it, make sure your use state is imported up at the top. What's your error?
Never mind. I figured it out. The cons task, that task, I put it inside of the use state instead of outside.
Ah, gotcha. The biggest React mistake that I have made recently is I was doing everything. I could console log the data. I could see it here, and it just like was not showing up in the return. And I'm like, why in God's name is this not rendering the data? Like, I've used React for almost a decade now, and it's just not working for me. And it turns out that I accidentally used curly braces here instead of square, like array brackets. React gave me no error message, no problem with anything, just carried on. And for like a solid 30 minutes, I was just like, React hates me. I've broken React. I don't understand. And when I found that I had just like, how many times have I created a use state variable? Like, I clearly know that it's square brackets. And I was just so mad when I found that. Okay, let's go through, let's comment out some of this code. So we really
Can I
start.
see your internet, your browser?
Yep.
I was debugging. I want to make sure I got it. Okay, nice. Thank you.
Yep. Not pretty. Only one thing there so far. We'll pretty it up tomorrow or on Monday, but for now. Quick reminder before I forget, because I definitely will. Office hours Sunday, 1 p.m. Encourage you guys to be in person at Common Space, but we'll also have the Zoom room open. Come for questions or bring some popcorn and see other people's questions. But Sunday, 1 p.m. Be there, be square. Totally optional. Okay. Any questions that you guys have lingering before I comment comment all of this out?
Wait, dumb question, but why do we have to use like map again?
Yeah, because this is coming back as a list. It's coming back as an array. So if there are multiple things in the database, we need to tell it, we'll loop through each item in the database and display it this way. So .map is just a special type of loop that React works particularly well with. Okay, so we start up at the very top here. We say number one, set up state to as an empty array to eventually store the tasks coming back from the backend. Then we say when the component loads, make the API call. Technically, it comes down here, it does the render, there's nothing in the task, so it doesn't show anything. The component first loads, it comes in here, it makes the API call, we come in here. That's all kind of what's happening under the hood in React. I'm not going to go super far into that, but I'm going to say number three, go make the API call to the tasks endpoint on the backend. And you know what? Realizing I did not do this in order, so apologies. What really happened before we even got the front end set up, before the user even loaded anything, what did we do? We turned on our server first. So I need to modify some of the numbers here. Sorry, my mistake. Let's do it like this. Number one, import Express, which is a node API framework. Cores, which lets front ends access our API, and PG, which is the Postgres database client from npm. These need to be installed before we can import them. set up our Express server and tell it to allow CORS requests. Set up connection details for Postgres client. Feel free to interrupt me at any time if you don't understand the note or have questions about it. Connect to DB using details from number 3. Create endpoint at root URL to send back some data. Create another get endpoint at the /tasks URL. After creating all endpoints, tell the server to listen on port 3001. Now, the server's in chill mode. It's like, I'm listening on 3001, but I'm not going to do anything until you send me a request. So the server's out there running in the background. NPM started, nodemon is going. It's good. It's chilling. Now we come over here and we say, hey, someone has loaded the front end. They went to mywebsite.com. They went to myawesome-to-do-list.com. They need now to show, they need to do the front end stuff. So now we say, hey, 8 is setting up state. 9 is saying when the component loads. 10 is going to go make that API call. Now the browser freezes and it says, I need to await for this fetch to be done. So what do? We jump over here to the tasks and we say 11, a request came in from the front end to this endpoint. Move this up here. Run a SQL query using the connection from 3 and 4. Store the results in DB result. Extract the rows from the result and send them back in a response to the request on the front end number 10. So backend says, all right, I got a request in. 12, it goes to the database and goes, yo, database, give me all the data from to-dos. Data comes back into DB result. The backend server then extracts out the rows and sends back only the tasks to the response of the request in the front end. So we come over here and we say 14, parse the JSON from the backend. 15, set the data from the backend into state. State wakes up here and says 16 state is updated using set tasks method. Comes down here and says 17 state has been updated. So rerun this map. And 18 using each individual task in the database, show a new LI that uses the task ID for a key and the name column for the contents of the bullet. Okay, I did that way faster than I thought I was going to, but a full 18-step process that took us all class, took us 2.5 hours of class to set up. The good news is we don't have to install Beekeeper again. We don't have to install Postgres again. Those are done. Those are out of the way. Honestly, that's the smoothest it's ever gone in any cohort. So kudos to you guys for getting those installed. We have our first full stack app. I'm going to encourage you guys to take at least 2 minutes to read through these numbers. Make sure you understand the comments before you get out of here. This is something that I want marinating in your head over the weekend. So when we pick this up on Monday, it will be absolutely delicious. I mean, we'll be able to add in the tasks really easily through a post request and all of that stuff. So we're not completely done this project, and we've got chat project to do after it. But this is a really solid starting point for full stack applications. If we don't get this, it is a very slippery slope that I've seen many times of you guys just going along for the ride and realizing that we don't understand the complicated stuff because we don't understand the basic flow of the data here. So make sure you guys are understanding this, of course, on Monday and during office hours on Sunday. So you guys have any questions about this before we add even more to it. So I'm going to shut up for a couple minutes, let you guys read through the numbers, see if you have any questions. If you don't have any questions, you are welcome to get out of here a couple minutes early. Have an awesome weekend. If I don't see you office hours on Sunday, I will see you all on Monday. But I will stick around for a couple minutes, read through these comments on the live share. I'm also going to throw this code up on GitHub right now so that you guys can reference it there as well. Code is also up on GitHub if you'd like to reference it.
What do you mean by number 6?
So an endpoint is basically any URL that we're creating to run a chunk of code. And so one endpoint we created here is this get endpoint that just sends back hello world and favorite animal, right? Endpoints have basically 3 pieces of information about them. The URL that we use to get to that endpoint, the method, the get, post, patch, put, delete, whatever, and then the code that runs when the request comes into that endpoint that we respond to. So this is another endpoint because it uses the method get, it has the URL of tasks, and then the code that's running is the database query that's responding with the rows.
So we don't need, well, I mean, so we do need the request right where next to async.
Correct. Yeah, because otherwise the request is basically just a placeholder right now so that we get access to the res. Right. If we put if we just put this in, it's going to think what we called res is the actual request. We were like, no, we need the res. So it's very common to see rec and res, even if you're not using the request data. During Monday's class, we'll actually see using the request data. So the request is always coming in, but we don't always use the data in the request. Sometimes we just respond without the details of the request itself.
And for 12, do we need to use the typical literal for the select star from to do this, or?
You don't. This can be a regular string, although oftentimes when we're writing a query, we're using some data in the request. So we'll use $ curly braces basically. So I'm trying to get in the habit of using template literals more, so I can just $ curly brace anywhere. But it's just a string. You could do that as single or double quotes, and it would work exactly fine. The other reason we do backticks there is because just like in our insert query, sorry, I'm not sharing my screen. We use single quotes here, right? So oftentimes if we write an insert statement, we've got to use single quotes and we don't want them to interact with the double quotes on the outside. So using the backticks is kind of just a precaution that we probably won't be using backticks in the query itself.
So 15, we're taking the data from 14 and putting it into setting it into set tasks.
Yep.
Okay.
So we're going, if the visual helps, we're going from the fetch into the response into the data here, tasks into the tasks here, set tasks here is going into the tasks here, and these tasks here are getting mapped over here, and then we're using that task there to get out the name.
So wait, so wouldn't that fill the use state all the way at the top near task? Task set?
Yes, it does.
Okay, I'm starting to understand a little bit more.
So important to understand it at this level because it only gets more complex here, right? We're going to add in database relations on top of this. We're going to add in post requests. We're going to add in update and delete information, right? And so this obviously is very complex. I'm not trying to sugarcoat it. So understanding it here, and we're going to do that with the chat application as well. We'll get a little bit more practice, a little bit more complexity. We'll keep on layering it on. If you're at the point where you're like, I kind of get it, no freaking idea where to start on my capstone of making all of this work, that's okay, right? Like, we're not technically even in week 1 of full stack. I jumped the gun a little bit. We started a day earlier of full stack. So still all marinating in. All you need to do for this weekend is start thinking through your database design for the ERD that's due Sunday night. You still got 3 weeks before any of this full stack stuff comes into your capstone. We're going to get a lot more practice. What is much more important, though, is getting all the way to step 18 here and saying, all right, I not only understand those comments, I could delete the comments and leave the numbers and write a comment myself of how I'm understanding it, or I could delete all the code with just the comments left into it, and be able to write that line of code from there. Those are two different approaches that that test your brain in different ways, but are both very good exercises. See one, do one, teach one. Say that is true expertise. Can you see someone do one? Can you do it yourself? And can you explain what you did to someone else so they can learn how to do it? Years and
Wait.
years of being a software engineer, I had not hit mastery because I never taught anyone how to do it. Now that I've taught someone how to do it, I'm much more confident in saying, hey, I know this pretty well.
You said see one, do one, and tell one?
Teach one.
Oh, teach one. Got it.
I think there are definitely variations of that. Credited to William Stewart Halstead, who was the first chief of surgery at Johns Hopkins Hospital. He actually set up the model that when you go into a doctor's office and someone else follows the doctor in who's like a medical student, he was the one who set up that model. Fun fact, learned that tonight. I mean, I knew I hadn't come up with that term. I just didn't know who had come up with it. All right, final call for questions tonight. All right. Have a great night, everyone. Hopefully we'll see you guys Sunday at 1, virtual or in person at Common Space. Otherwise, see you all on Monday.